On June 4th, an FDA advisory committee gathered to review the data from the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials for PTSD. The clinical trials determined that 2/3 of the study participants were no longer meeting criteria for PTSD after 3 sessions with MDMA. And not only that, their results were sustained for over 6 months.
The FDA has designated it a breakthrough therapy.
So what happened?
Liz Barone, I voted no.
Jess Fedorowicz, I voted no.
Roger Narendran, I voted no.
I voted no. I also said no.
No.
I said no.
Walter Dunn, I voted yes.
There are 2 yeses and 9 noes.
It was a total train wreck. The committee voted nearly unanimously against MDMA as an intervention for PTSD.
A key FDA advisory committee today rejected the use of a psychedelic drug to help patients struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'm going to save you the 9-hour meeting.
Statistically significant difference from placebo of 8.91.
And give you the top 10 absurd, outrageous, things that were said.
Lykos is a therapy cult.
And share how a small group of radical activists appear to have manipulated the media and possibly derailed a federal regulatory process in a way that could end up denying millions of people a life-saving treatment.
Let's get started. Number 10. The panelists kept talking yada, yada, yada about functional unblinding.
The potential impact of functional unblinding on interpretability.
The functional unblinding clearly occurred.
About the potential impact of functional unblinding.
I voted no. The functional blinding, it didn't feel right.
This study was approved and it's designed by the FDA in 2017.
The FDA already knows that, functional unblinding is a concern, that you cannot blind psychedelics effectively. And they approved the trials with this design anyway.
The FDA was very well aware of this issue. It's just that the panelists weren't. And that they weren't is not a problem of the study. It's perhaps a problem of the panelists.
One would have thought that this advisory committee would have some awareness of the fact that these are long-standing and well-known issues in psychedelic research. And the way that they were discussing these issues sounded like they were just discovering them for the very first time.
Number 9, lack of diversity accusation.
Lack of diversity was raised.
There's not enough data on diverse populations.
I voted no. Really concerned with this lack of real inclusion of BIPOC participants. This seems to at least help people more if they're white.
The fact is, more than 50% of participants in the second confirmatory part of the phase 3 trials identified as BIPOC or Hispanic, aka not white.
The data showed there was no difference in response across different racial and ethnic groups.
The panelists were never corrected. Number 8, accusations that Lykos did not report negative outcomes.
Omission of adverse events is one of the specific allegations leveled against the applicant.
Symposia, who represents pretty radical anti-capitalist, oftentimes anti-military ideologies, has been able to infiltrate and manipulate a lot of people in the media and organizations like ICER, and it seems like the AdCom process.
During the public commentary, the panelists heard from a small group of radical activists called Symposia.
They have referred to veterans as imperialists, white supremacists, and murderers. So given how they feel about people in the military, maybe it's no wonder that they're against actually treating veterans with PTSD.
Symposia spoke as if they were independent voices.
None of them disclosed their connection. I personally think that lack of transparency is unethical and troubling.
Lykos has obscured its actual intervention in its submissions to the FDA.
Omission of serious adverse events within MAPS-sponsored clinical trial publications.
I've observed gross mishandling and misrepresentation of clinical trial data.
Symposia was also a key source for the ICER report. Before the FDA advisory meeting, they published a questionable report accusing the clinical trial of systemic issues. These were then published by the media. And who was ICER's source of these systemic issues? Symposia.
Symposia have succeeded in promoting circular referencing and circular reporting.
Unverified and sensational claims,
creating a cloud of doubt about the trial's integrity that seems to have influenced the FDA advisory committee.
The trial should be scrutinized as if Scientology or Nexium had submitted a new drug application to the FDA.
The panelists discussed this for literally hours.
There's also concern about a lot of the adverse events not being perhaps recorded correctly.
Adverse events associated with MDMA should be recorded.
Seeing less adverse events.
Until an actual member of the FDA stepped in and said this conversation needs to stop.
I've heard some comments about outside reports of potential misconduct in the studies. Although we are aware of those reports, we consider them to be unverified at this point until we do our own inspections. So the discussions and voting should be based on what is contained within our briefing documents.
But of course, the content was already in the room.
Some of the issues that were discussed at great length with no evidence base, like the whole issue of integrity of the study. This hearing has created more confusion than clarity.
It completely distracted the conversation from the great results we're seeing from MDMA. And it's going to potentially affect the care for millions of people.
Number 7, accusations of psychedelics as a movement. And panelists kind of grabbed onto this as if a movement would not be able to hold integrity in data and science.
I submit that Lykos is a therapy cult that uses the application under review to change people's beliefs as part of an ongoing project of global spiritual conversion.
Much of the backing of the manual is based in New Age psycho-spiritual theory.
The level of interest, even people referring to this as a movement.
There's a movement, there's a lot of hype.
I find the comments about, the quote-unquote movement, I find those to be ridiculous and really incredibly unhelpful, even if one has the audacity to happen to believe that the results of an experimental intervention might work. The system is not set up to allow that to succeed. That's why we have all of these regulatory processes in place.
Just because a lot of people are desperate for a new treatment does not impact the science within this carefully protected study. Number 6, too low of a dropout rate. A lot of the panelists were shocked that study participants didn't drop out.
Very low dropout rate in spite of a very involved treatment that required fasting, prolonged in multiple sessions. That's not the sort of dropout we would typically see in that, which suggests a very high level of interest in engagement and allegiance.
Their lack of dropout is, remarkable. I've never seen anything close to it, which does kind of make me question the selection bias.
They were like, maybe they were so desperate to make it work that they stayed in there.
Well, there was such a low dropout rate, and they were probably selected to, do better on MDMA.
Again, they were looking for an alternative explanation to the results in front of them, which just seemed too good to be true, right?
What about maybe it was working? I think we need to look at the testimonials.
2 weeks ago, a friend who lost his leg in a roadside bomb called me, begging to try the therapy that saved me. That simple ray of hope has saved so many lives, but I fear what will happen to them if this therapy is not approved.
It helped give me compassion for myself and allowed me to see my experience in Afghanistan in a new light.
I was 5 when first sexually assaulted by a family friend. MDMA-assisted therapy saved my life. PTSD is no longer my life sentence. How many more people need to die before we approve an effective therapy?
By 2018, I had tried many medications and therapies without any relief or hope of healing. It wasn't until I went through the crossover study and received MDMA that I finally have been able to heal and remain in a healed state beyond just a few months.
During my own MDMA therapy session, I came face to face with my own racial trauma. My healing from this session was so profound that I decided to get trained in MDMA therapy myself.
Maybe these results are like something we really need to consider. Number 5, the panelists complained that 40% of the participants had a previous MDMA experience, which is higher than the average number in the population, which is 10%.
The 40% of previous users, I think that would make the safety profile look better than it is.
Because 40% of them already know that, they had probably had a good experience and they enroll selectively and then they come in and they believe it's going to work.
But here's the deal.
There was no difference in the efficacy amongst the people who had a prior use history from those who did not have a prior use history.
There was actually no observable differences in the actual study.
These are people with severe PTSD who had done MDMA without therapy, and they weren't cured because they came into the study and they had full-blown severe, moderate to severe PTSD. So MDMA at a rave does not cure PTSD. It's only when you combine it with the psychotherapy, then you get these remarkable results.
Number 4, questioning the therapy component.
The psychotherapy is really vague. It is not well determined. It seems like it was not standardized.
I wrote the manual basically that describes the therapy in detail, and it's part of the material that I thought the advisory committee would have reviewed.
What's described as really a relatively vague, ill-defined treatment, psychosocial intervention, that I think it would be hard to standardize across arms, and I'm not convinced that it was equal across arms.
The adherence to the manual is around 90%. If it's 100%, then it's too rigid. But 90% is a very good value for adhering to manualized therapy. So it is a standardized approach to treatment. And that was such a basic misunderstanding of the whole treatment, that the idea that someone was deciding based on that misunderstanding was very upsetting.
So of course therapy cannot be regulated by the FDA, but this doesn't mean that therapy isn't regulated or that there aren't bodies that standardize the types of care and interventions that are offered. Number 3, the structure of the committee itself. So panelists continuously said, I'm out of my lane, like they're out of their expertise, and they knew that.
I have to disclaim that I am not a psychiatrist, and I struggled a bit with this question because this panel has been very unique to me as a toxicologist, and once again, this is a little out of my lane. But I agree with being way out of my lane with this one. But
and still they spoke to matters that were out of their expertise.
So perhaps we need a larger sample size to better quantify the relative contribution of the psychotherapy. I feel like this is really narrow when therapy plays such an important role.
Yeah, I mean, and I wouldn't not be surprised if people go home and use cocaine, use alcohol. I mean, with their partner who's supposed to be responsible, you're going to have left and right issues. That's my personal feeling on it. You can see it coming.
Only one panelist had any experience of significance with psychedelic-assisted therapies. Ironically, this is the dude that voted yes.
Walter Dunn. Ultimately, I voted yes. We are in dire need of new treatments for PTSD. I think that the effect sizes are still large enough that this treatment, drug plus psychotherapy, can be effective for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder.
The ways that the advisory committee were discussing this really seemed to betray a pretty profound lack of understanding of what the intervention was.
Number 2, an accumulation of their bad arguments to make a bad decision.
MDMA and this treatment have really impacted a number of people in positive ways, but it seems like there are so many problems with the data that each one alone might kind of be okay. But when you pile them up on top of each other, when you've got unblinding and there's not enough data on diverse populations or people with severe PTSD. So I think there's just a lot of questions still.
Just because the panel was outrageous enough to make multiple mistakes doesn't merit a no on the vote.
It's actually felt strange to vote no when the p-value started with 3 zeros. There was just too many problems with it.
There was nothing that was raised that, in my view, would rise to the level of denying approval.
And number 1, get ready for this one. An actual panelist said,
we already have evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and yes, they do have dropout rates, but they do have really strong outcomes. They're covered by insurance. What is the burden on providers to be providing that treatment when we already have treatments that are really effective?
That's completely completely unacceptable.
In a world where 20 veterans are committing suicide every day, and our current approved interventions, as a clinician, quite frankly, are embarrassing and laughable. This is the first PTSD treatment to make it this far in 25 years through the FDA.
With 3 doses of this drug, people are being cured for at least 6 months. This result is twice as good as what you get with current standard of care therapies.
You guys, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of complex PTSD, it works. Even with all the serious flaws of this hearing, there is still hope.
Unfortunately, this advisory committee's no vote is not binding on the FDA. Let's urge the FDA to follow the science when making their final determination.